Good morning, everybody. This is the TSMU fan here, and today we'll be keeping the 75th anniversary review-a-thon going with Journey Beyond Sodor as the next movie to talk about. This movie being the first movie to be animated by Jam-Filled Toronto instead of ARC Productions, and this movie being the sixth movie written by Andrew Brenner. Sorry that this one took a bit of a long time to come out. As you all know by this point, I've been sidetracked with stuff such as other video projects and stuff in real life that I just couldn't get to working on this. But anyways, without further ado, let's get started. The plot of this movie is that James thinks that he is Sir Topham Hatt's favorite engine, and when he is assigned to take a goods train to the mainland, Thomas takes it from him and ends up getting lost along the way. He meets a whole bunch of new characters and eventually gets stuck in a steelworks where two devious engines named Hurricane and Frankie force him to do the jobs at the steelworks. Thomas eventually breaks out and gets the help of some experimental engines to save James from the steelworks, who came there to look for Thomas. After the ordeal, Thomas and James return safely back to Sodor. Now, let's of course start off with what the bad things are in this movie first. The worst aspect of this movie, without a doubt, is the bouncing bodies. This movie was the first movie to feature them, and it just does not work. It's even more annoying because the bouncing is inconsistent in parts. There are scenes where the engines are staying still as they normally would, and then a few shots later they start bouncing out of nowhere. As I said before in my Blue Mountain Mystery review, the proper way to handle bouncing is to keep the weight of the engine in mind and only use it if an engine is scared or laughing. This movie is by far one of the best examples of how not to handle the bouncing. Another thing that I didn't necessarily like was the ending. Hurricane and Frankie were practically forcing Thomas to be their slave. But at the end, they say that the reason they keep engines at the steelworks is because nobody ever wants to work with them. Well, that's certainly not an excuse for what they did to Thomas. They tried to force both Thomas and James to work with them when both engines didn't want to, and at the end, we're just supposed to forgive them? No. When you have a villain in your movie with a goal to stop the protagonist from doing something, you need to give them their comeuppance at the end. Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure showed Sailor John getting flat out arrested for his crimes. And even Day of the Freaking Diesels gives Diesel 10 some comeuppance when Sir Topham Hatt yells at him at the end. Don't just rush the moral that everybody has to forgive each other because it's a kid's movie. Give your villains some comeuppance. Plus, the scene of Frankie crying at the end is just so annoying. Ugh, make it stop! I also don't really know why, but this movie feels a little bit too fast-paced. There's just something about some of the scenes that make them feel like they're being edited quickly just to hold a kid's attention. While big and interesting scenes are a must to hold your attention, you shouldn't force them into scenes where they don't really make sense. Otherwise, your movie just ends up feeling rushed. I also did not like Beresford the Crane one bit. He comes into this movie out of literally nowhere and doesn't add anything to the plot other than hiding Thomas from Hurricane and Frankie when they pass by with James. I've heard some people say that the Beresford scenes were supposedly a last-minute addition to make the movie have a 73-minute running time, and I definitely agree with those people if that's the case. Beresford does not do anything in this movie, and when he appears again in Thomas and the Royal Engine, he doesn't do anything in that either. He's just a pointless character, who you'd probably expect to be some kind of merchandising gimmick by Mattel to put him in the movie just to sell toys, but nope. This dude has pretty much zero merchandise, making him literally pointless. You could literally cut out Beresford scenes in both this movie and in Thomas and the Royal Engine, and it wouldn't even make a difference in the story. I also didn't like the cartoony stuff that was in this movie either, such as the scene where Thomas, Merlin, Lexi, and Theo pop up from behind the bushes. Excuse me, what? They aren't even on any tracks! This is the sort of thing you'd see in a musical number, not a regular old scene. Speaking of that, let's talk about how they handled scenes that were set outside the reality of the movie in this movie. Before this movie, in Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, they very clearly established that all of the songs that were in that movie were set outside the course of reality, what with all the strange and bizarre visuals. Journey Beyond Sodor, meanwhile, does not respect these boundaries between what is and isn't happening. There are multiple moments in this movie where a character references a song that a different character sings. So what does that mean? Does that mean that that they're actually singing the songs in this movie? That's just weird. If you're going to make your movie a musical, at least establish that what is happening in these songs isn't also happening in the reality of the movie. Because when you don't do that, it just makes these weird and wacky visuals even more infuriating, because now you know that this is actually happening. Also, Thomas being thrown around the steelworks like a volleyball at the end was totally unrealistic too. Don't the engines have weight to them? Realistically, even if that barrel hit Thomas at the speed it did as he was falling into the lava, I highly doubt that it would have been enough to knock him completely out of the way. I also didn't really like the experimental engines all that much, especially Lexi. While she does have some funny moments in this movie with some funny voices, sometimes she can just get a little annoying. The only experimental engine that I think really had some potential was Merlin, and I'll talk about him later when I mention the good things that were in this movie. Another thing that I didn't really like was the moral of the movie, and how at the end, the movie really hammers it on the head that the moral is the most important thing is being friends. If you're going to make this extremely simple moral that pretty much every single kids show ever has done before, then you need to make it subtle. If you hammer it on the head with a musical number to end the movie on, the moral just comes across as forced. Anyways, I think that might just be all the bad things that were in this movie, so now let's move on to the good things that this movie had to offer. The best thing about this movie, in my opinion, was the songs. Just like The Great Race, this movie had some real bangers of tunes, especially The Hottest Place in Town. I also really like Thomas's song where he sings about wanting to go home. While the lyrics can be a bit cheesy in places, you can really tell with this song how badly Thomas misses his friends back home and the places on his branch line that he knows so well. Now, I did mention the experimental engines earlier in this video, so now it's time to talk about the experimental engine that had the most potential in this movie, and that experimental engine is Merlin. In this movie, Merlin is actually based off of a real King Arthur class that had 3 funnels just like he does, and the 3 funnels were part of a wartime experiment. The smoke was meant to disperse from the funnels and make the train less visible to bombers overhead, which explains why Merlin thinks that he becomes invisible when he blows smoke out of his funnels like he does in the movie. Also in this movie, Merlin is voiced by Hugh Bonneville, who is another big English star, like how Olivia Colman, who plays as Marion, is also a big English star. And while Merlin does appear in another episode after this movie, that episode being Seeing is Believing from season 22, I really feel like they missed a big opportunity to make Merlin a really interesting character in this movie. Merlin comes into this movie more than halfway into this thing, and he doesn't really do anything interesting other than thinking he is invisible and warning Thomas that Hurricane and Frankie were coming back. I really feel like to make him a more interesting character, they could tie into his real life basis a little bit more and explain that maybe the reason why he's such a good hider is because he's always on the run or something, I don't know. While I do really like that this movie isn't the last time we see him, I really feel like Merlin could have been a really interesting character if they'd just spent a little more time with him. Speaking of characters that didn't really get enough time spent with them, I really feel like Hurricane and Frankie could have been some really interesting characters, especially Hurricane. I do like how it's implied that Hurricane and Frankie have been keeping engines hostage at the steelworks for a while, but that's really about it in terms of development for them. There's a scene in the movie where Frankie tells Hurricane that the steel won't deliver itself, and you can tell that Hurricane is showing a small bit of annoyance to Frankie bossing him around in this scene. Maybe during the finale you could have Hurricane backstab Frankie and help Thomas and the experimental engines escape and give him a redemption arc, I don't know. Now, let's talk about the plot of this movie and how well it was handled compared to The Great Race. As I mentioned in my review video on that movie, the movie didn't really keep its focus on the race itself, and instead chose to focus on Thomas and his efforts to get to go to the Great Railway Show. As a result, the race doesn't happen until pretty much the end of the movie. So I really appreciate how they realized their mistakes from that movie and made this movie completely focused around Thomas trying to escape the steelworks. The steelworks doesn't show up until the last half of the movie or anything like how the race in The Great Race does. This time they show it early and have a build up to the action of Thomas trying to escape the steelworks to get back home to Sodor. While I do really like how this movie is way more focused on what the plot of the movie is supposed to be about and doesn't waste any time in getting to the good stuff, I will say that the Beresford scenes were a real stopping point and just slow the plot down to a grinding halt. But I already talked about Beresford earlier and how much of a pointless character he is, so let's move on. Another thing that that I really liked about this movie is the music itself. The music is really grand sounding in parts, especially the opening theme combined with the narrator explaining all the sights to see on the island of Sodor and how the main line works. And I love the magical, mysterious feel that the music has when Thomas sees the steelworks for the first time. I really feel like Chris Renshaw definitely did a good job on the music for this movie, and I really like the score he composed for this. It's definitely one of my favorite movies that he's done the music for. Another thing that I really liked about this movie were all the funny moments that were in it. Of course, at the beginning, you've got Thomas and James breaking the fourth wall by James letting Thomas sing a song even though he gets interrupted. The scene where the station master or whoever is trying to get that piece of paper while Sir Topham Hatt is talking to Thomas about James was definitely a funny sight gag. There were also a couple scenes in this movie that felt like they were poking fun at the Miller era as well, with Sir Topham Hatt mentioning cheese vats that need to be taken to Vickerstown and coconuts that need to be taken to Arlsburg as examples. I also really like the troublesome trucks in this movie. So many different kinds of them appear as a part of Thomas's train, and it's fun to hear them banter with each other and make fun of Thomas. And that truck that kept saying, "Are we there yet?" was also a pretty funny moment in this movie. Another funny moment that I really liked was the scene where James arrives at Bridlington to look for Thomas. For one, it's awesome to see the shunting diesels from the Great Race up close and personal, but the fact that they're always just so done with everything is so hilarious. Another really funny moment that made me laugh was when Hurricane and Frankie were singing their song to James, and James straight up interrupted their song to ask where Thomas is. That was super funny, and the way James interrupts them by saying that their song was very entertaining was extremely funny as well. And I really like the ending where Henry comes into the sheds while the engines are singing and asks what he missed. Well, I'm sorry to say this, Henry, but you just missed the entire movie.
I suffered dreadfully, and no one cares.
Anyways, I also like the scenes where it's revealed that to keep track of which engine is where on the island, Sir Topham Hatt has a table with a map of Sodor on it and uses his own toy trains to represent the engines while pushing them around with a stick. That definitely was a nice little detail in this movie, and it makes sense that Sir Topham Hatt would have a system like that in place to keep track of which engine is doing what job at what place. Anyways, another thing that I really liked about this movie were the subtle references to other Thomas episodes. In the scene with James at the sheds where he's talking about what might have happened to Thomas, he makes references to the episodes Down the Mine and Thomas Comes to Breakfast by mentioning that maybe Thomas fell down a mine or ran into a station master's house. The wiki also says that there's apparently a reference to The Adventure Begins in this movie, but I wasn't really able to find it. I think the closest that I could get to finding a reference to it was Frankie telling James that Thomas probably wanted to see the world after James asked her where Thomas was. Anyways, I think it's finally time to talk about the animation in this movie. As I mentioned in my Great Race review, ARC Productions went bankrupt the year that movie came out, and Jam-Filled Toronto took over the animation for the show moving forward. I'll definitely say that in this movie, Jam-Filled's animation is very similar to ARC's animation, which makes sense considering that the wiki says that the first half of the movie was animated by ARC before they went bankrupt, which explains why the animation is so similar to their style. However, I do not like Jam-Filled's animation in later episodes and specials. Everything looks way too shiny, and there's just something about the way the scenes are lit that just makes the animation look strange and almost unfinished. But for their first movie, I will say that the animation was pretty good, especially since they had to try to replicate ARC's style from scratch after the first half of the movie. With that, I think that might just be all the good things that were in this movie. So now let's move on to what the miscellaneous things I noticed in this movie were. The biggest thing that I noticed from looking on the wiki was that there were a couple references to the famous 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. These references being one of the trucks on Thomas's train saying that,
"I have a feeling we're not on Sodor anymore,"
and Hurricane crying out about how he's melting being a reference to when the Wicked Witch of the West melts. This is actually the second Thomas production to reference The Wizard of Oz. The first time being in the episode Stepney Gets Lost when Stepney says,
"There's no place like home."
I really like the Wizard of Oz references in this, especially the line when Thomas sees the steelworks for the first time. It definitely adds to that mysterious factor, and the grand reveal of it was so well done. Anyways, another thing that I want to bring up is that before this movie movie was coming out, there were a lot of articles circulating rumors around the internet about the experimental engines Lexi and Theo. According to these articles, apparently Lexi is supposedly gender fluid, and Theo supposedly has autism. While I don't really see where people are coming from saying that Lexi is supposedly gender fluid, as she seems pretty female to me, I can kind of see where people are coming from when they say that Theo has autism. Theo is shy, doesn't really have a lot of confidence in himself, shakes around a lot when he moves, and has a very slight lisp. A lot of these seem like they might be autistic traits, and believe me, I know all about autism. There was a girl in my class who had it so bad that she couldn't really function without an aide to help her. I do see where people are coming from saying that Theo supposedly has autism, and interestingly, when Theo says,
I think I can't,
in the movie, he was making a reference to the famous children's book, The Little Engine That Could. That's honestly just a nice little reference, and honestly, that book almost feels like it could be an actual episode of Thomas in like season 1 or something if you tweaked it a little bit. Anyways, I think that's really about it in terms of the miscellaneous things that were in this movie, surprisingly enough. The rest of the trivia that the wiki lists is either not really all that interesting, or is in my opinion, not really worth talking about. So I think I'm going to end this review here. This movie was definitely an interesting one, so to speak. I really feel like it wasn't really bad, and it wasn't really good. In my opinion, this movie is just okay. There were some really nice scenes in this with Thomas trying to escape the steelworks, and Merlin was a really interesting character with a very interesting basis, but overall, I just feel like this movie is just okay. That's really all that I've got to say about it. It's an okay movie with some really good as well as some really bad things. But overall, I'd say that this movie was definitely better than The Great Race. Because as I mentioned earlier, this movie knew to keep its focus on Thomas and James escaping the steelworks. While I don't really feel like this was an excellent movie or anything, it definitely was a real journey to remember. Anyways, that's the end of this video, and make sure to be on the lookout for my review on... Wait a second, hold on, which movie is next again?
Wait, so I reviewed Thomas and the Magic Railroad, I reviewed Calling All Engines, I reviewed The Great Discovery, I reviewed Hero of the Rails, I reviewed this piece of garbage, I reviewed Day of the Diesels, I reviewed Blue Mountain Mystery, I reviewed King of the Railway, I reviewed Tale of the Brave, I reviewed The Adventure Begins, I reviewed Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, I reviewed The Great Race, and I just finished reviewing Journey Beyond Sodor. I don't think there's any other Thomas movies that are left to be reviewed. Oh wait, what's this?
Oh boy. Prepare yourselves, guys. We've got a lot to talk about in the next review. Anyways, that's the end of my review on Journey Beyond Sodor. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. This is the TSMU fan signing out. Special thanks to a patron of mine who has chosen to remain anonymous. If you'd like to learn how to get your name at the end of every new video that I upload, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I've linked it on my YouTube channel's banner.